who has been, as I said, who is a notable hardliner. And it makes it, I think, absolutely clear that there is not going to be any negotiation anytime soon about the future, of seeking a future, a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. The hardliners in Kiev remain very much in control. They feel they have the backing of the United States and probably Britain. For the moment, they're not prepared to countenance negotiations. The only circumstance, I think, in which they would perhaps countenance negotiations would be in the event that the Russian forces reach the Dnieper and Kiev itself becomes threatened. And then, even then, I suspect the only negotiations that they would countenance would be negotiations rather like those which happened in March last year, which so far as the hardliners are concerned, were basically an exercise in playing for time, which is of course also true about the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement, Ukraine signed it without any real intention of carrying it out, again, purely as an exercise in playing for time. So I don't personally think that negotiations are pending. I don't think Zelensky is interested in negotiations or looking to negotiate. I think his advisor gave this interview to the Financial Times. He said, look, if we succeed in this counteroffensive, we might sit down and talk with the Russians, or we might go ahead and try to attack the Crimean Peninsula ourselves. But in either case, as I said, he wasn't saying anything new, and the overall thrust of his comments seemed to me to be essentially to say that Ukraine wants the Crimean Peninsula back. It will take it either by force or if the Russians hand it over, and that's it. Neither of which I think is a realistic possibility. But there we go. Now, that brings me to the news from Beijing, because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and Ursula von der Leyen have both just visited Beijing, and they have been there with, and they've had meetings there with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And in fact, there's been a rather amusing picture of the three, Xi Jinping, Ursula von der Leyen, and Macron, sitting at a huge round table. Xi Jinping is at the center, behind the Chinese flag, and Ursula von der Leyen and Macron are located an enormous distance from each other and an enormous distance from Xi Jinping. As a number of people have pointed out, when Macron was meeting with Putin last year in the run-up to the current spate of the fighting, there was a lot of ridicule about the fact that he was at one end of a long table from Putin. Well, this, in some respects, reproduces that format. In fact, it perhaps emphasizes the centrality of Xi Jinping, but the international media this time has hardly commented on this. Anyway, we've had a lot of information coming out about Macron's visit. Now, there's been a number of things. The first is that apparently the Chinese, polite as they always are, willing to speak and discuss matters at length, as again they always are, were nonetheless somewhat irritated by the way in which Macron apparently spoke twice as long in his one-to-one meeting with Xi Jinping as did Xi Jinping himself. And I have to say, this is, in my opinion, very characteristic of Macron. Last year, in the run-up to the war, the recent spate of the fighting, Macron had some exhaustive, prolonged, multi-hour meetings with Putin. And he came, and apparently it was he who did most of the talking. Putin was listening, and he came up with all sorts of extraordinary abstract claims about need for a new security architecture in Europe, about all kinds of things about, avoiding conflicts and setting up settlement proposals and all of these things. And the Russians listened, and they tried to pin Macron down, and they never could. He was making, in the most general and abstract terms, sounds which the Russians perhaps liked. But when it came to offering anything concrete, he came up with nothing. And by the end of these discussions, I understand that the Russians were getting extremely exasperated, and Putin as well, Putin, who spent a huge amount of time with Macron, became frustrated and disappointed. In fact, at that famous Security Council meeting on the 21st of February 2022, the one that was heard which took place in public, and in which the Russian leadership discussed the recognition of the independence of the two breakaway republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, I noticed that there were comments made about the hours that Putin had spent the night before talking to Macron. And anyway, I gather that the Chinese didn't take very kindly to this either. They didn't like the way in which Macron was, as I said, talking over Xi Jinping, who was, after all, the host. And beyond that, I noticed that they were perhaps not entirely happy with some of the things that that Macron said in a joint press conference that he had with Xi Jinping. And over the course of it, I noticed that the Guardian account, the original Guardian report of this press conference, in it, Macron is spoken of as having asked the Chinese to bring the Russians to their senses, and that this is a translation of what Macron supposedly said at this press conference. Well, afterwards that was watered down, and it was said that Macron instead, this is in public, mind you, with Xi Jinping by his side, said that the Chinese should work to bring the Russians to reason. Now, the last is undoubtedly what Macron did actually say. And as I said, the Guardian itself corrected its translation. But, of course, from a Chinese point of view, all of this is completely unacceptable. They would not have taken kindly to Macron talking in that way, and to Macron basically saying that the Russians are out of their senses, or at least irrational or unreasonable, or that the Chinese should be trying to win the Russians round or change them round. So what was discussed in all of these meetings between Xi Jinping and Macron and Ursula von der Leyen? Well, the Chinese and the French came out with a joint statement about peace in Ukraine. Now, this is a joint statement where Macron essentially repeats all the Chinese talking points about the fact that there should be a peaceful settlement, that nuclear weapons and all of those sort of things should not be used. It's very close to the sentiments of the Chinese 12-point position paper, because of that, the British, at least, don't seem to be very happy with this joint statement that the French and the Chinese issued. Can I just say on that, by the way, that the British media has been by and large negative about Macron's visit to Beijing. And of course, there's been a lot of statements from the Chinese about needing to put EU-Chinese relations back on track, about China not being a party to the conflict in Ukraine. So why is the conflict in Ukraine an issue between the EU and China at all? About the mutual importance of good relations between China and the EU, a lot of that sort of thing. So I get the impression that the Chinese, in their careful way, were basically saying to the Europeans, look, we're still here, we're open for business with you, as we always have been. We're not looking for a quarrel, we're not here to argue with you or fight you in any respect. Ultimately, where this relationship goes, this relationship between China and the EU, is entirely up to you. It doesn't ultimately up to us. If you decide to make a Ukraine an issue between us, well, you're acting irrationally. That would be foolish. That would be borderline crazy, because we've done absolutely nothing that would merit that kind of behavior. But ultimately, we're not going to change our foreign policy. We're not going to abandon our Russian friends. We're not going to turn on them in any way. We're certainly not going to try to put pressure on them. This isn't your business. Our relations with the Russians are perfectly amicable and friendly, and we're developing a very close partnership with them. We see that as a strategic relationship between them and us. We are not here to quarrel with the Russians. If you start raising this as an issue between yourselves and us, then of course it will become an issue. But the people who will suffer most in consequence will be you. Whether the Europeans are capable of understanding this message is, of course, another matter. I rather doubt it. Actually, the fact that Macron, again, was unwise enough to hint that China would be colluding in a crime if it still aligned itself with Russia suggests strongly not. But there we go. That's where we are. And for the record, I personally think that relations between China and the EU are just going to continue to deteriorate from this point on, not necessarily because of the situation in Ukraine, but because the impetus from the United States is very much now pushing the EU itself to take an approach to China that is eventually going to lead to a deterioration in relations. So that's what I wanted to say about Macron's visit to China. I don't think it's changed anything, just as all those visits by Macron to Russia on the eve of the fighting, the breakout of the fighting in February, didn't change anything either. There has been one other very important visit which has taken place, which has attracted perhaps less attention internationally, though it is very consequential. And that is that President Lukashenko of Belarus has made another trip to Moscow, where he's had a further meeting with President Putin. And this was a long meeting, and they covered a lot of ground together, apparently. And this comes after that announcement about a week ago that the Russians were we're going to locate tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, and growing information about the integration of the Belarus Air Force, which it now turns out, something I didn't know, operates Sukhoi 30 fighter bombers, advanced Russian-built fighter bombers. Anyway, all of that, the militaries of the two countries, Belarus and Russia, are now largely integrated with each other. And I get the sense that this skew of agreements that has been reached between Putin and Lukashenko are taking Belarus a further step in the direction of full economic integration with the Russians. And I have to say that at some point, going further down the line, I expect this economic integration to evolve into a position where Belarus and Russia form a single currency, based most probably on the ruble, and where there will be also political reunification in some form as well. Now, one point I would make, and it's perhaps one that people are not perhaps fully aware of, is that one of the reasons why Lukashenko, until fairly recently, was was strongly opposed to full economic integration between Belarus and Russia, was because, in my opinion, very genuinely and sincerely, he opposed many aspects of the Russian economic model. He felt it was far too neoliberal for his tastes. He supports within Belarus itself protection of these big industrial plants left over from the period of the Soviet Union, places like the giant Maz factory, which makes enormous vehicles, used to be used by the Soviets to haul around nuclear missiles and those kind of things. Russia still imports these machines from Belarus in large quantities. Anyway, Lukashenko was very anxious to preserve these plants and would provide important employment for their workers. And he felt that too close an integration of Belarus into Russia would undermine the future of these plants and of the working class voters who are his core electoral support base. Now, the pressure of the war has caused the Russians to make major changes towards their economic in their economic model. It's become increasingly clear that these giant factories, Uralvagonzavod, the Chelyabinsk tractor factory, the Omsk factory, which used to make T-80 tanks and which was revived some years ago and refurbishes T-80 tanks, the giant Kirov works in St. Petersburg, all of these factories, still state-owned, still very much part of the Rostec umbrella, if you like. These plants, these factories, which form a core part of the Russian military-industrial complex, that the Russians are now intent on not just preserving them, but on reactivating them, reinvesting machinery and plant in them, giving more jobs for workers who operate them. In other words, the Russian economic system is starting to look more like that of Belarus. And I think from the perspective of someone like Lukashenko, that makes Russia suddenly a more attractive place than it has been up to now. It's a place which makes more sense for Russia to integrate with, for Belarus to integrate with, than was the case even a few years ago. And this, beyond the huge geopolitical shifts, the fact that Lukashenko has had to survive a color revolution attempt, all of those things, all which would have inclined him to shift towards Russia anyway. Today's Russia looks more like the model that Lukashenko would have probably liked to see fully developed in Belarus than it has looked like in the past. And I can't help but think that in some respects, and this reflects a lot of what the tone, if you like, of Lukashenko's statements, it's increasingly looking to me as if one of the reasons for his newfound enthusiasm in pursuing integration with the Russians is not just political, but because he feels that his outlook, his perspective is winning through, and that it is in fact the Russians who are coming closer to him and are, as he would see it, coming home. Anyway, we'll see how all of this works out. The big, tantalizing, unanswered question remains what happens with this Ukrainian offensive. Secretary Blinken of the United States has made it very clear that the United States is looking for this offensive to happen within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And I suspect that means it's not going to happen immediately, but as I said previously, I've no doubt that it is going to happen fairly soon. I think that too much from Ukraine's point of view is now riding on the future of this offensive. If it fails, we will be in a completely different geopolitical place. These moves, both in China with the Europeans and with Lukashenko in Moscow, basically are telling us this. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today.